The promise in the sunlit classroom. The kindergarten classroom buzzed with life, a lively mix of children's laughter and the scraping of crayons on construction paper. The air was heavy with the sweet, nostalgic scent of paste and freshly sharpened pencils. At a small round table near the windows, two children sat shoulder to shoulder, their heads bent low over their respective projects. Ethan Johnson was a spirited boy with messy blonde hair that seemed to defy calms. His blue crayon had broken under the enthusiastic pressure of his hand as he worked to color a firefighter's uniform on his drawing. Next to him sat Naomi Carter, her dark curls perfectly braided and secured with rainbow barrettes. Her small hands worked carefully, filling the petals of a sunflower with bold strokes of yellow. Noticing Ethan's dilemma, Naomi glanced up with a smile. "Here," she said, holding out her blue crayon. "You can use mine." Ethan's eyes widened. "Really? Thanks." He accepted it gingerly, as though it were made of gold. To reciprocate, he nudged his own crayon box toward her. "You can use any of mine, too." Their teacher, Ms. Halpert, observed the interaction from her desk and smiled warmly. It wasn't uncommon to see acts of kindness between the students, but there was something particularly endearing about these two. "You know," Naomi began thoughtfully, "my mom says sharing is what makes people happy. Like when she shares flowers from her shop, people always smile." "My dad says helping people makes them happy," Ethan countered. "That's why he became a firefighter. I want to help people too." Naomi's face lit up. "When I grow up, I'm going to own a flower shop just like my mom's. You can visit and buy flowers." Ethan nodded earnestly, as if he were already planning which bouquets he'd buy. "And when I grow up, I'll make sure your flower shop is safe from fires." By lunchtime, their newfound friendship was solidified over a tray of sandwiches, peanut butter, and jelly for turkey and cheese. It wasn't long before nap time arrived, and they found their mats next to one another. While other children drifted to sleep, Ethan and Naomi whispered secrets about their homes and treasures. Naomi spoke of the shiny buttons in her treasure box, and Ethan described his collection of cool leaves. "We should be best friends forever," Naomi declared, her voice as soft as a breeze. Ethan grinned. "Yeah, forever. Pinky promise." She extended her tiny hand. Their pinkies entwined solemnly, and Ethan whispered, "Promise." The day drew to a close, but not before Naomi dashed to her cubby and pulled out a bracelet she had woven the night before. It was a swirl of bright red, yellow, and blue, and the knots were uneven, but it was vibrant and full of love. "This is for you," she said, holding it out. "It's a friendship bracelet. My sister helped me make it." Ethan's eyes widened as he accepted it. "For me? Thanks. I'll wear it forever." Naomi beamed as she tied it snugly around his wrist. "You have to. It's the rule." On the playground the next day, as the two swung side by side, Naomi turned to Ethan with sudden seriousness. "When we grow up," she said, "we should get married. Then we'll really be together forever." Ethan nearly lost his grip on the chains, his face turning red. "Married." Naomi nodded with absolute confidence. "Best friends should stay together forever, and that's what married people do." He hesitated but then nodded quickly. "Okay, I promise." The promise, sealed with all the gravity two 5-year-olds could muster, floated between them like a sacred secret. It would tether their lives in ways they couldn't yet comprehend, even as life began to pull them in separate directions. Years later, as Naomi and her family prepared to move to another city, she gave Ethan one last look over her shoulder. He stood by their classroom's window, his face pressed against the glass, clutching the bracelet on his wrist as though it were his last link to her. She raised her hand in a small wave, tears streaking her cheeks. The moving truck pulled away, and Ethan whispered, "I'll never take it off, Naomi. I promise." For both of them, the promise became a touchstone, a symbol of a time when life was simpler and love was as pure as the morning sun, a farewell in the rain. The next morning, Ethan sat in the classroom, his usual energy absent, the chair beside him, Where Naomi always sat was empty. His fingers idly traced the edges of the friendship bracelet on his wrist, the vibrant colors a stark contrast to the dull ache in his chest. Ms. Halpert knelt by his desk, her kind eyes full of understanding. "Ethan," she began gently, "I know it's hard when a friend moves away, but you can still stay in touch. You can write her letters or draw her pictures. I'm sure Naomi would love that." Ethan nodded, his lips pressing into a firm line. "I will," he said softly. "I'll write to her every day." By recess, Ethan's resolve to keep his promise strengthened. He ran to the playground, his sneakers splashing through small puddles from the previous night's rain. The swings hung still, glistening with droplets, and the monkey bars seemed lonelier without Naomi there to race him to the top. He found a spot under the big oak tree, their favorite hiding place during hide-and-seek. Sitting cross-legged, he pulled out a piece of paper and a crayon from his pocket. His handwriting was shaky, but he carefully wrote, "Dear Naomi, I miss you already. The classroom feels different without you. I still have the bracelet you made me, and I promised I'll never take it off. I hope your new house is nice. Don't forget about me. Your best friend, forever, Ethan." Folding the paper carefully, he tucked it into his pocket. He wasn't sure where to send it yet, but it felt like the right thing to do. That evening, the sky opened up, releasing a steady drizzle that tapped rhythmically against Ethan's bedroom window. He sat at his desk, the soft glow of his nightlight illuminating his sketchbook. He began drawing their imaginary neighborhood, the one they'd dreamed up in kindergarten, with houses side by side and a big treehouse connecting them. His mom knocked gently before stepping inside. "Ethan, sweetheart, I know you're sad," she said, her voice warm and soothing. "Change is hard, but you're strong. Naomi wouldn't want you to be unhappy." Ethan nodded, his focus still on the sketch. "Do you think she'll remember me, Mom?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His mother smiled softly, brushing his messy blonde hair out of his eyes. "Of course you will. True friends never forget each other." Naomi, miles away in her new home, sat cross-legged on her bed, her room still half-packed with boxes. She held a small photo frame in her hands, the picture inside showing her and Ethan grinning wildly at the camera on their last day of kindergarten. Her heart felt heavy, and her fingers brushed against the frame as tears welled in her eyes. Her mother entered, carrying a plate of cookies. "Sweetheart, I know moving is hard, but you'll make new friends." Naomi looked up, her eyes brimming with determination. "I don't want new friends. I already have a best friend." Her mother set the plate down and hugged her tightly. "You're a strong girl, Naomi, and strong friendships have a way of finding their way back, no matter how far apart you are." That night, Naomi pulled out a notebook and wrote her own letter. "Dear Ethan, I miss you so much. My new room is big, but it feels empty without you. I can see the stars from my window, and I wonder if you can see the same ones. I hope we'll see each other again someday. I'll always remember you. Your best friend, Naomi." As days turned into weeks, Ethan and Naomi both found ways to keep their promise alive. Ethan wore the bracelet every day, its colors fading slightly, but its significance never diminishing. Naomi tucked their photo into her backpack, carrying it with her wherever she went. Though they didn't yet understand the full weight of their childhood promise, their bond was like the roots of a mighty tree, hidden beneath the surface, but unyielding and deeply intertwined. And so, even as life pulled them onto different paths, the promise they made under the kindergarten sun remained unbroken, waiting for its moment to resurface. The distance grows. The years following Naomi's departure passed in a blur for Ethan. Seasons came and went, each marking the passage of time with subtle changes. Yet, one thing remained constant, the colorful bracelet on his wrist. Despite the wear and tear of childhood adventures, he refused to remove it. To Ethan, it wasn't just a piece of string. It was a lifeline to the memory of his best friend. A growing void. By the time Ethan turned 12, the bracelet's colors had faded to muted shades, and the knots had frayed. But he had found ways to preserve it. A few drops of clear nail polish, stolen from his mother's vanity, kept the threads from unraveling. His friends teased him occasionally. Still wearing that old thing? His best friend Liam teased one afternoon as they sat on the school bleachers after soccer practice. Ethan shrugged, brushing off the comments as he always did. "It's important," he replied simply. Liam laughed. "What is it?" "Your good luck charm." Ethan didn't respond. He didn't expect anyone to understand. To him, the bracelet wasn't about luck. It was a promise. Though his memories of Naomi had grown hazy over the years, the emotions tied to their childhood vow remained vivid. In quiet moments, he still thought of her. Did she remember him? Was she happy? Sometimes he would sit under the oak tree on the playground, the place where they had once shared secrets and laughter, and wonder if she ever thought of him too. Naomi's new world. Meanwhile, in her new city, Naomi adjusted to a life that looked different from the one she had left behind. The bustling streets, her new school, and the sprawling parks offered distractions, but she often found herself staring at the small photo frame on her nightstand. It contained the last picture she and Ethan had taken together. Her classmates were friendly, but making new friends wasn't easy. Naomi carried a quiet sadness with her, one that she couldn't fully explain. Jessica, a kind-hearted girl with a passion for math, became her closest companion. Yet even with a new friendship blossoming, Naomi felt a lingering void. One afternoon, as she and Jessica worked on a group project, Jessica noticed the photo on Naomi's desk. "Who's that?" Jessica asked, pointing to the picture. Naomi hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame. "That's Ethan. He was my best friend back home." Jessica tilted her head curiously. "Do you still talk to him?" Naomi shook her head. "No, we used to write letters, but it's been a while. I guess life got in the way." Jessica nodded knowingly. "Sometimes that happens, but real friendships, they don't go away. They just wait." That night, Naomi pulled out her old notebook. The letters she had written but never sent were still tucked between its pages. Her hand hovered over the notebook for a moment before she closed it again. What would she even say after all this time? A chance reminder. The first year of high school brought new challenges for Ethan. Classes were harder, and soccer practices became grueling. Still, he kept the bracelet on his wrist, even during games and training sessions. During a particularly tough practice, Coach Davis called for a water break. Ethan sat on the bench, catching his breath, when one of the freshmen pointed to his wrist. "Why do you always wear that?" the boy asked, curiosity replacing the usual teasing tone. Ethan glanced at the bracelet and smiled faintly. "It's from an old friend." "Like a girlfriend?" the boy pressed, grinning. Ethan chuckled. "No, just a promise." "Do you still talk to them?" Ethan paused. He hadn't thought about that in a while. Not for a long time. That night, as Ethan lay in bed staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on his ceiling, he wondered why he had let their communication fade. Life had gotten busy, but was that really an excuse? He turned over, his fingers brushing against the bracelet. Maybe I should write to her, he thought. But doubt crept in. What if she didn't remember him? Or worse, what if she didn't care anymore? Naomi's struggles. In her junior year of high school, Naomi's life took an unexpected turn. Her parents, who had always seemed so stable, announced they were separating. The news hit her like a tidal wave. She tried to focus on her studies and extracurricular activities, but the tension at home made it difficult. One evening, as she sorted through a box of old keepsakes while packing to move with her mom, she found the photo of her and Ethan again. The sight of their younger selves, grinning without a care in the world, brought tears to her eyes. Life had felt so simple back then. She picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over the search bar. She hesitated, then typed Ethan Johnson. A dozen results appeared, but none seemed to match. Frustrated, she set her phone down and stared at the photo. "I wonder if you're happy," She whispered to the boy in the picture, "I hope you are." A crossing of paths. The final years of high school were marked by milestones for both Ethan and Naomi. Ethan was named captain of the soccer team, his leadership skills shining both on and off the field. His dream of becoming a doctor grew stronger, fueled by countless hours volunteering at the local hospital. Naomi, on the other hand, channeled her energy into academics, excelling in computer science and mathematics. Her teachers often praised her for her determination, but she still felt a lingering emptiness, especially during moments of quiet reflection. It wasn't until senior year, at a regional academic competition, that their paths nearly crossed for the first time since kindergarten. Ethan, attending as part of a science team, walked through the crowded conference hall, his bracelet still on his wrist. Naomi, seated in the front row of the auditorium, was focused on her presentation. Though they were in the same room, neither noticed the other. Fate, it seemed, wasn't ready to bring them together just yet. The bond that never broke. By the time they graduated high school, both had grown into remarkable young adults. Ethan stood tall on the soccer field, the crowd cheering as he accepted his diploma. Naomi walked confidently across the stage at her school, clutching her own diploma with pride. Though miles apart, they both carried the weight of their childhood promise. For Ethan, the bracelet was a constant reminder of the vow he had made. For Naomi, the memory of their friendship was a quiet source of strength. As they embarked on their respective journeys, Ethan to medical school and Naomi to university, neither could have guessed how the threads of their lives would weave back together. But one thing was certain: the promise they had made under the kindergarten sun still held power, waiting for the moment when fate would bring them face to face once more. Unraveling paths. Ethan's new world. Ethan Collins arrived at Metropolitan University's medical school with an overwhelming mix of excitement and nerves. The sprawling red brick campus buzzed with activity as students hurried between classes, coffee shops, and libraries. He clutched the acceptance letter in his bag, a symbol of years of relentless effort. Yet, as he stood among the throng of bright-eyed students, the weight of his childhood promise felt heavier than ever. The first weeks were grueling. Classes began at dawn and stretched late into the evening. Anatomy labs smelled of formaldehyde, and his nights were spent hunched over thick textbooks in the library. His wrist often brushed against the faded friendship bracelet as he wrote notes, a quiet reminder of the past that fueled his determination. "You're always here," Sarah, one of his classmates, remarked one evening as she slid into the seat across from him in the library. Her auburn hair was pulled into a loose bun, and she carried the same exhausted look that they all shared. Ethan glanced up and smiled faintly. "It's the only way to stay ahead." She gestured to his wrist. "That bracelet, does it help you focus or something? I've seen you touch it a lot." Ethan hesitated, running his thumb along the worn threads. "It's from someone important. A long time ago." Sarah leaned in, curious. "Someone important like a girlfriend?" "No," Ethan said quickly, shaking his head. "Just a friend. But a really good one." He didn't elaborate, and Sarah didn't push. Still, the conversation stirred something in Ethan. He hadn't spoken about Naomi in years, but he found himself wondering about her more often lately. Did she ever think of him? Did she still remember their promise? Naomi's rise and struggles. Hundreds of miles away, Naomi Patterson stepped into the glass-walled office of Patterson Technologies, a company she had founded at just 22. The steady hum of computers and quiet conversations filled the air as her team worked tirelessly on their latest project, a cutting-edge encryption software aimed at revolutionizing data security. Naomi adjusted the sleeves of her tailored blazer and glanced at the digital clock on her desk. The day was packed with meetings, presentations, and deadlines, but she thrived under pressure. The company's success was her proudest achievement, the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice. But not everything was as polished as her office exterior. At home, her relationship with Marcus, her husband of 3 years, was unraveling. Once charming and attentive, Marcus had grown controlling and dismissive over time. His sharp words and icy silences cut deeper than she let on, and the cracks in their marriage were becoming harder to ignore. One evening, as she sifted through financial reports in her home office, Naomi's phone buzzed with a message from her assistant, Sarah. It was a reminder about an upcoming charity gala. "Can't we skip this one?" Marcus muttered from the couch, his voice laced with irritation. "You're always dragging me to these things." Naomi sighed, keeping her tone calm. "It's important for networking, Marcus. You know that." "What I know," he snapped, "is that you care more about your company than your marriage." His words stung, but Naomi bit her tongue. She turned back to her laptop, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed. She couldn't afford to let emotions distract her, not with so much at stake. The bracelet's weight. Ethan's second year of medical school brought him into the world of hospital rotations. He spent long hours shadowing doctors, observing surgeries, and comforting patients. Each day felt like a test of his resilience and commitment. One afternoon, during a break between rounds, Ethan sat in the hospital cafeteria, sipping black coffee. He noticed a little girl sitting at a nearby table with her mother. The child's wrist bore a brightly colored friendship bracelet, much like the one Naomi had given him years ago. "Mommy," the girl said, holding up her wrist, "do you think my friend will wear her bracelet forever?" Her mother smiled. "If she's a good friend, she will." Ethan's chest tightened. The memory of Naomi tying the bracelet onto his wrist came rushing back. The promise they'd made had seemed so simple then, yet it had shaped so much of his life. He pulled out his phone and opened the social media app he rarely used. Typing Naomi Carter into the search bar, he hesitated. Would she even remember him? Did she still go by her maiden name? He pressed search, but the results yielded nothing definitive. Frustrated, he put his phone away and returned to his coffee. An unexpected encounter. The following month, Naomi attended the charity gala with Marcus, who sulked the entire evening. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. Her public persona was polished and confident, masking the turmoil she felt inside. "Mrs. Patterson," a deep voice said from behind her. She turned to see James Hollis, a tech journalist she had worked with before. "Your encryption project is making waves. Any chance you'll give me an exclusive?" Naomi laughed lightly. "You know I can't reveal too much, James. But let's talk next week." As James walked away, Naomi caught sight of a familiar face across the room. A man with sandy blonde hair and a reserved yet confident demeanor. He was speaking with another guest, his white shirt sleeves rolled up slightly, revealing a faded bracelet on his wrist. Her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. Could it? Before she could approach him, Marcus appeared at her side, his expression sour. "Let's go. I've had enough of this." "Marcus, I'm networking," she said, irritation creeping into her voice. "You're parading," he shot back. "You've made your rounds. Let's leave." Naomi hesitated, her eyes darting back to the man across the room. But when she looked again, he was gone. A missed connection. Ethan, unaware that Naomi had been so close, left the gala feeling out of place. He'd only attended at the urging of a fellow medical student who insisted it would be good for networking. The event had been glamorous, but he found himself thinking more about Naomi than the wealthy guests around him. On his way out, he paused near the coat check, pulling his jacket over his shoulders. A woman brushed past him, her perfume faintly familiar. He turned, catching a glimpse of her dark curls, but she disappeared into the crowd before he could say anything. Shaking his head, Ethan dismissed the thought. "It's just the memory playing tricks on me," he told himself. The first glimmer of fate. Weeks later, Ethan received a new hospital rotation assignment. He was to shadow the chief resident at a prestigious hospital across town. On his first day, as he reviewed the patient list, one name stood out: Naomi Patterson. His heart raced as he stared at the name. Could it be her? It had to be. Taking a deep breath, Ethan prepared himself for the possibility that the promise he had held onto for so long might finally bring their paths back together. The reunion begins. An unfamiliar familiarity. The hospital hallways buzzed with quiet efficiency as Ethan Collins reviewed the patient files for the day. The chief resident had handed him a clipboard with a list of names, their medical issues outlined in neat bullet points. One name stood out like a beacon: Naomi Patterson. Ethan's pulse quickened as he stared at the name. He couldn't be sure it was her, but his instincts screamed that it had to be. The age, the details in the file, it all lined up. Yet, a lingering doubt whispered in his mind. It's been so long. What if it's just a coincidence? Collins, Dr. Martinez, the chief resident, called out, interrupting his thoughts. Room 212 needs a thorough workup. Elevated blood pressure, stress-related symptoms, headaches, the works. It's your case today. Ethan nodded, clutching the clipboard tighter. Room 212. Naomi Patterson. It was the moment he hadn't realized he'd been waiting for all these years. As he approached the door, his nerves felt unusually taut. He had delivered bad news to patients, assisted in surgeries, and handled countless high-stakes situations. But this was different. This was personal. Steeling himself, Ethan knocked softly before stepping inside. Face to face, Naomi sat on the edge of the examination table, her back straight, and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was dressed in a tailored blouse and black slacks, her usual poise faltering under the weight of exhaustion. Dark circles underlined her eyes, and a tension in her shoulders betrayed the stress she carried. Ethan hesitated for a moment, taking her in. She looked so different yet unmistakably the same. Her hair was styled in soft curls that framed her face, and her dark eyes carried a depth that time and experience had etched into them. Those eyes, however, still held a spark of familiarity, the same spark that had captivated him as a child. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions within him. "I'm Dr. Collins, and I'll be handling your care today." Naomi glanced up, her gaze meeting his. For a split second, her brows furrowed, as if trying to place him. Then her expression softened, recognition dawning like the sunrise. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The air in the room seemed to shift, the clinical sterility replaced by an undercurrent of nostalgia and longing. Ethan's heart raced, but he maintained his composure. "It's been a long time, Naomi." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she looked down at her lap, her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't expect. I mean, it's really you." Ethan smiled faintly, stepping closer. "It's me, and it looks like you've done pretty well for yourself." He gestured to the clipboard. "CEO of a tech company. That's impressive." Naomi gave a small, strained laugh. "And you're a doctor. I always knew you'd do something amazing." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of years and unspoken words filling the space between them. Ethan cleared his throat, bringing his focus back to the task at hand. "Let's start with your symptoms," he said gently. "Your file mentions high blood pressure and stress. How long has this been going on?" Naomi hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the door. "It's been a while. I've been dealing with a lot lately. Work, personal stuff. I guess it's catching up to me." Ethan nodded, pulling out his stethoscope. "Let's take a look." As he listened to her heartbeat, a wave of protectiveness washed over him. The memory of the little girl who had given him a friendship bracelet and made him promise to always be there for her resurfaced vividly. The woman sitting before him now seemed weighed down by a burden she hadn't shared. An unspoken burden. After completing the examination, Ethan sat on the rolling stool across from Naomi. "Your symptoms are consistent with chronic stress, but we'll run some additional tests to rule out anything more serious." Naomi nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Thank you." He hesitated before adding, "Naomi, if there's something more going on, something that might be contributing to your stress, you can talk to me. As your doctor, Or as your friend? Her eyes flickered with a mixture of surprise and gratitude, but she quickly masked it with a neutral expression. It's just work, she said, her voice measured. Running a company comes with a lot of pressure. Ethan studied her for a moment, sensing that there was more she wasn't saying. But he didn't press. Well, we'll do everything we can to help you feel better. As he finished writing his notes, Naomi's gaze fell to his wrist. Her breath hitched when she saw the bracelet, its faded threads still intact after all these years. You kept it, she said softly, her voice laced with awe. Ethan glanced down at the bracelet and smiled. I promised I'd never take it off. Naomi's eyes glistened, and for a moment, the years between them seemed to disappear. But before she could say anything, the door opened abruptly, and Marcus strode in, his presence as commanding as it was overbearing. An unwelcome intrusion. There you are, Marcus said, his tone sharp as his eyes landed on Naomi. Are we done here? We have a meeting in an hour. Naomi visibly tensed, her shoulders stiffening. Not yet, she replied evenly. Marcus turned to Ethan, sizing him up. Doctor, is this going to take much longer? My wife has a lot of responsibilities. Ethan met Marcus's gaze calmly, his professionalism unwavering. Her health is the priority right now. We're running some tests to ensure there's nothing serious. Marcus scoffed, crossing his arms. She's fine. She just needs to manage her stress better. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. High blood pressure isn't something to dismiss. Stress can have serious effects if left untreated. Marcus rolled his eyes, but Naomi quickly stood, her voice steady. Marcus, please, let Dr. Collins do his job. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing more. Instead, he pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails with an air of impatience. Ethan glanced at Naomi, his concern deepening. We'll talk more after the tests, he said, his voice gentle. Naomi nodded, her expression grateful. Thank you. As Marcus ushered her out of the room, Ethan couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. The way Marcus spoke to her, the tension in her posture, it all pointed to something deeper than stress. For the first time, he wondered if Naomi's return to his life wasn't just coincidence, but something more. A quiet determination. Later that evening, Ethan sat in his small apartment, staring at the bracelet on his wrist. The day's events replayed in his mind, each interaction with Naomi stirring old feelings and new questions. She wasn't the same carefree girl he remembered. Life had changed her, shaped her into someone stronger, but also someone carrying invisible scars. He couldn't ignore the way Marcus had treated her, the way her spirit seemed dimmed under his presence. Ethan clenched his fist, the bracelet pressing into his skin. He had promised to always be there for her, and that promise hadn't changed. Whatever Naomi was going through, he was determined to help her, even if it meant stepping beyond the boundaries of his role as her doctor. The cracks in the armor. The morning after, Naomi woke up in her sprawling but cold bedroom, sunlight filtering through the sheer curtains. Her head throbbed, not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of the emotions she'd been suppressing for years. The previous day had been a whirlwind. Seeing Ethan after so long, the warmth of his presence colliding with the suffocating reality of her life with Marcus. Sitting up, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror across the room. Her reflection looked as tired as she felt. She noticed the faint bruise on her wrist, where Marcus had gripped her the night before, his temper flaring over her wasting time at the hospital. Naomi turned away, unable to look at the evidence of what her life had become. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was Sarah, her assistant, with a text. Morning. Quick reminder about today's board meeting at 2 p.m. Call me if you need anything. Naomi stared at the message, her fingers trembling. She'd built a life of success, of polished meetings and industry accolades, yet beneath the surface, she was crumbling. Her mind drifted back to Ethan, his steady gaze, his genuine concern, and the faint but undeniable warmth she'd felt in his presence. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder, What if things could be different? Ethan's determination. Across town, Ethan was already deep into his hospital rounds, but his mind kept returning to Naomi. He couldn't shake the tension he'd felt when Marcus had barged into the exam room. It wasn't just the man's dismissive attitude. It was the way Naomi had shrunk under his words, like someone who had been silenced too many times. During his lunch break, Ethan sat alone in the cafeteria, staring at his barely touched sandwich. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through Naomi's file again. It felt like he was piecing together a puzzle, and the missing pieces were buried beneath years of unspoken pain. Still thinking about yesterday, Jenny, one of the nurses, asked as she sat down across from him. Ethan glanced up, startled. "What do you mean?" Jenny smirked. "Don't play dumb. Everyone saw the way you looked when Marcus Patterson walked in. You wanted to deck the guy." Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I'm not just worried about him. I'm worried about her. There's something she's not saying, and I don't know how to help." Jenny tilted her head thoughtfully. "You can't force someone to open up, but if she's in trouble, maybe you being there is enough to remind her she's not alone." Her words lingered with Ethan for the rest of the day. As he returned to his rounds, he resolved to keep an eye on Naomi, not just as a doctor, but as the friend he promised to be all those years ago. The boardroom clash. The board meeting that afternoon was tense. Naomi sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, surrounded by her executive team. Marcus was there too, despite her request for him to stay out of business matters. He sat with his arms crossed, his presence a looming shadow over her. As Naomi presented their new encryption prototype, Marcus interrupted frequently, questioning her decisions in a way that made her team visibly uncomfortable. "Do you really think this rollout is the best use of company resources?" he asked, his tone condescending. "Seems like a gamble to me." Naomi's jaw tightened. "We've analyzed the data thoroughly, Marcus. This project will position us as leaders in the market." Marcus scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "If you say so." The tension was palpable. When the meeting finally ended, Naomi stayed behind, her hands gripping the edge of the table as she tried to steady herself. "Naomi," Sarah said softly, stepping back into the room. "Are you okay?" Naomi forced a smile. "I'm fine. Thank you, Sarah." But she wasn't fine, and she knew it. A confession begins. That evening, Naomi found herself parked outside the hospital, staring at the entrance. She didn't know why she had come, only that she needed to talk to someone, and Ethan was the only person who felt safe. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and walked inside. The bustling energy of the hospital was almost soothing, a reminder that life moved on, no matter how chaotic it felt. She found Ethan in his office, hunched over a stack of files. When he looked up and saw her, surprise flickered across his face, quickly replaced by a warm smile. "Naomi," he said, standing. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." She hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Ethan said quickly, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "What's going on?" Naomi sat down, her hands twisting in her lap. I wanted to thank you. For yesterday. You didn't have to check in on me, but you did." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "Naomi, I told you. I'm here for you, if something's wrong." Tears welled in her eyes, and she quickly looked away. Everything feels like it's falling apart. My company, my marriage." Her voice broke, and she took a shaky breath. "I don't know how to fix it." Ethan's heart ached at her vulnerability. "You don't have to do this alone," he said gently. "Whatever's going on, we'll figure it out together." Naomi looked up at him, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. "Do you mean that?" "Of course," Ethan said firmly. "I promised you a long time ago that I'd always be there for you. That hasn't changed." A catalyst for change. As Naomi left the hospital that night, a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in years began to stir in her chest. Hope. For so long, she had carried the weight of her world alone, believing that no one could truly understand. But Ethan's words, his unwavering support, reminded her of the girl she used to be, the girl who believed in promises and possibilities. Meanwhile, Ethan watched her leave, his mind racing. He didn't know exactly what Naomi was facing, but he was determined to help her find her way through it. The little boy who had promised to protect her was now a man with the means to do so. And as their lives began to intertwine once more, both Ethan and Naomi would discover that the promise they had made so many years ago was stronger than the forces that had tried to pull them apart. The promise rekindled. A breaking point. Naomi sat alone in her car, parked in the driveway of her sprawling suburban home. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of her dashboard. The silence around her was suffocating, broken only by the steady tapping of her fingers on the steering wheel. She knew Marcus was inside, likely nursing his third drink of the night and waiting to launch into another argument. Her mind replayed the events of the day, Marcus's cutting remarks in the boardroom, Ethan's kind words in his office, and the warmth she felt in his presence. It was a stark contrast. One man who chipped away at her confidence, and another who seemed to want nothing but to build her up. She tightened her grip on the wheel. For years, she had endured Marcus's controlling behavior, his sharp words, and his calculated attempts to undermine her. She had convinced herself that she could manage it, that she had to manage it, because failure wasn't an option. But now, sitting there in the dark, she realized she couldn't keep living like this. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Sarah. The financial discrepancies are worse than we thought. Marcus has been transferring funds from company accounts to private ones. We need to act. Naomi stared at the message, her chest tightening. She felt the walls closing in, the weight of everything threatening to crush her. But then another thought emerged, a memory, faint but steady, like a distant light in the darkness. Ethan. His calm voice. The bracelet still on his wrist. The promise they had made as children, a promise she had almost forgotten, but that he had clearly never let go. She opened her contact list, hesitated for a moment, and then called him. The call that changed everything. Ethan was sitting at his small kitchen table, poring over medical textbooks, when his phone buzzed. Seeing Naomi's name on the screen, his heart skipped a beat. He picked up immediately. Naomi. Her voice was quiet, almost trembling. Ethan, I didn't know who else to call. His chest tightened. What's wrong? Are you okay? There was a long pause, and then she said, Can we meet? I need to talk to someone. I don't think I can do this alone anymore. Ethan didn't hesitate. Of course. Where are you? She gave him the address of a nearby park, and he promised to be there in 15 minutes. As he grabbed his keys, he felt a sense of urgency and determination. Whatever Naomi was going through, he wasn't going to let her face it alone. The midnight meeting. The park was quiet, the moon casting a soft glow over the empty benches and tree-lined paths. Naomi sat on a bench near the playground, her arms wrapped around herself, as if to shield against the cool night air. When Ethan arrived, she looked up, her face pale but resolute. He approached slowly, his concern evident. Naomi, he said gently, sitting beside her. What's going on? She hesitated, her hands fidgeting in her lap. It's Marcus, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He's been controlling, manipulative. And now I've discovered he's been stealing from my company. Ethan's jaw tightened. Have you confronted him? She shook her head. Not yet. I don't know how. He's so unpredictable. I'm afraid of what he might do. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You don't have to face him alone. We can figure this out together. Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked at him, her voice breaking. Why are you still here for me, Ethan? After all these years, why do you care so much? He smiled softly, lifting his wrist to show the faded bracelet. Because I made a promise, Naomi. And I've never stopped caring. Naomi reached out, her fingers brushing against the bracelet. I thought I was the only one who remembered. I never forgot, Ethan said firmly. Not for a second. A plan of action. Over the next hour, they talked. Naomi opened up about the years of emotional abuse, the financial betrayal, and the suffocating pressure she had felt to keep up appearances. Ethan listened intently, his anger at Marcus growing with every word. You have options, he said finally. You don't have to stay with him, Naomi. You're strong, and you've built so much on your own. You can take control of this. Naomi nodded, a spark of determination igniting in her chest. But I need proof. If I'm going to confront him, I need something concrete. Ethan thought for a moment. Do you trust your assistant, Sarah? Yes, Naomi said without hesitation. She's the one who discovered the financial discrepancies. Then let her help you gather everything you need. And if Marcus becomes a threat, Ethan's voice hardened slightly. You call me, no matter what. Naomi smiled faintly, the warmth of his words giving her strength. Thank you, Ethan. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'll never have to find out, he replied. The confrontation. The next day, armed with detailed financial reports and Sarah's unwavering support, Naomi confronted Marcus in their home office. She laid the evidence on the desk, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Explain this, she demanded, pointing to the documents. Marcus's face darkened as he scanned the papers. You've been snooping, he said coldly. I told you not to dig into things that don't concern you. This concerns me, Marcus, Naomi shot back. You've been stealing from the company I built. Do you have any idea what you've jeopardized? Marcus sneered, leaning back in his chair. And what are you going to do about it, Naomi? Go to the police. Ruin your perfect image. Naomi's hands clenched into fists. If you think I'm afraid of you, you're wrong. This ends now, Marcus. I'm filing for divorce, and I'm reporting everything you've done. His expression twisted into one of fury. You'll regret this. Naomi didn't flinch. No, Marcus. The only thing I regret is letting you have this much control over my life. A new beginning. 2 weeks later, Naomi finalized the legal proceedings to remove Marcus from her company and her life. It wasn't easy, and the process was far from over, but for the first time in years, she felt free. Ethan stood by her every step of the way, offering encouragement and support. Their friendship deepened, the connection they had as children blossoming into something more profound. One evening, as they walked through the same park where they had met weeks earlier, Naomi stopped and turned to Ethan. You saved me, she said softly. In more ways than one. Ethan shook his head. You saved yourself, Naomi. I was just here to remind you how strong you are. She smiled, her hand brushing against his. Well, thank you for reminding me. And for keeping your promise. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a new friendship bracelet, woven with the same bright colors as the one she had made him years ago. I thought it was time we updated the old one, he said with a grin. Naomi laughed, tears shining in her eyes, as she slipped the bracelet onto her wrist. It's perfect. As they stood there under the stars, the weight of the past fell away, leaving only the promise of a future built on trust, resilience, and a love that had defied the odds.